I am going to start this video with a question. What is this? And what is that? If you are like the people I tested this on, you probably answered the Mona Lisa and some variation of an old photograph. The most cultured among you, I imagine, may have guessed it's a collodion photograph, or even it's a Sallyman collodion photograph. And now here's the funny thing. Why didn't you answer a photograph of the Mona Lisa? Because that's what it is. We all know the real thing is in the Louvre in Paris. What you're seeing on your screen is a photograph. And why didn't you answer a field with a fence? Now, the Mona Lisa picture was so transparent that all you saw was the subject, the real thing. And the Sallyman picture is so untransparent, I almost want to say opaque, that all you saw was the artifact, the physical photograph, before you saw the content. Does this feel like a magic trick of sorts to anyone else? Let's dig into it. I am Nico. Welcome back to the channel, this time with a script that I'm reading from very professionally. I also am coming at you from a studio that I am borrowing from the public library. Use your public libraries, folks. Just too many birds at my house. I can't do it at home anymore. So previously here, we discussed information and emotion as a scale to sort and evaluate photographs against. And now that you've had a good long while to think about that, has it been over a year? I'm presenting a different scale that you can use in parallel. The scale of transparency versus untransparency. Yeah. So the first task, I think, is to find a better word for untransparent. And if we break it down, what gets you from this picture to that one? It's decisions made by the photographer. More specifically, it's decisions that leave a trace in the final image. In other words, it's authorship. Well, this artist made many choices to produce this image. Each choice was made with the goal of being unnoticeable, like a painter who works very hard to make the brushstrokes invisible. On the other hand, this artist made choices that would stay visible on the final print, like a painter that wants their brushstrokes to be visible and carry meaning. And a sign that you can see in an artwork and that you can trace back to the author's choices. That's authorship, folks. Please don't get this wrong. A very transparent artwork has just as much artistic value as a very authored one. The author of the transparent photograph has made just as many choices. They just went in a different direction with those choices. So I'm not going to break down the differences too much, show you a bunch of transparent photographs, a bunch of authored ones, and tell you to look at the difference, because you can and should do that on your own every time you see a picture for the first time. Hey, what am I seeing first here? Is it the subject? Am I looking through the photograph? Or, does the actual photograph arrest me and I see the subject later? What I think the interesting conversation to be had isn't how to tell transparency and authorship apart, but why use one or the other. So let's quickly go over the differences. The main idea is, with each choice that you make as a photographer, are you stepping further away from the way the eye perceives the thing in the real world? If you choose black and white, you took one step removed from the real world, because the real world, we see it in color. If you choose color, you're staying close to the real world. You're being more transparent. Are you choosing a razor-thin depth of field? You're one step removed, because this is not how our eyes perceive depth. Then, post-production, motion blur, anything you can think of. There's a huge number of choices one can make, and most of them I could never come up with, because that's creativity. We each find our own tools. So let's get to the juicy part instead. Why and when would one choose transparency or authorship? In what situation and to what end result? Diane Arbus talks about it in the intro to her Aperture monograph. The book was published posthumously, obviously, but if I remember correctly, the intro text is taken verbatim from a recording of a lecture she gave in a university. She says, "There's the thing photographed, and then there's the photograph. And the photograph is always more or less than the thing photographed, never an equivalent. You may have heard that quote before. It's a very interesting quote. So Arbus here is saying to her, there's no transparency. Your photograph is going to be more than the thing photographed or less. It will never be the thing photographed. With that in mind, a bit later in the intro, in the very end of the text, she says, "For me, the subject of the picture is always more important than the picture, and more complicated. I do have a feeling for the print, but I don't have a holy feeling for it. I really think what it is what it's about. I mean, it has to be of something, and what it's of is always more remarkable than what it is." So you see here that Diane's perspective is that the photograph is not transparent, we saw that before, and that usually she thinks the subject is more than the photograph. Why did I highlight this quote? Because next we're hearing from John Gossage, a photographer from the next generation from Arbus who came maybe 15, 20 years after her. Hear what he has to say on the Magic Hour podcast. I will link the actual episode.
Possibility that actually metaphor actually exists in the world. I mean, that's an interesting... The photography has more of a claim to actually being able to produce that kind of function than virtually anything else. It seems like there's no author, if done correctly.
So what he's describing here is transparency. Your photograph, if done well, will be a metaphor for the real thing, and it will seem like there's no author. So Gossage does think that a photograph can be transparent. He's not like saying like Arbus, it's always more or less. He's saying there can be a metaphor for the world. I have to say, when I found that quote, I felt pretty validated in this whole theory, because he even uses the phrase, there's no author. Like, transparency, authorship is right there with me. In the same interview, though, he says,
This opportunity to discover something meaningful in a day-to-day activity roaming around Omaha, Nebraska, say. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's a way to live a life, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, all the great events and everything, the pictures are always less than the event. My pictures are more than the event.
Yeah. There's a great richness to that.
That's interesting to me. That's life affirming.
Let's think about that. If you take a picture of a war or the Olympics, the picture, no matter how good, will be less than the event. But in Gossage's case, he says his pictures are more than the event. Isn't that a nice goal to have with photography? Remember when I told you guys that photography is not just a recording medium, it's a playback medium, and the thing you play back should be more than the thing you recorded? I mean, how cool is John Gossage? So we see here then that Arbus and Gossage have a different perspective on this. She firmly believes that the event, the real life, is always more than what the photography can record. And that's just a cool illustration of how art history works. One generation of artists have one view on their practice and have one ethos, and the next generation comes around and they can either expand on that or they can choose to challenge it. Like I said, Gossage came out maybe 20 years after Arbus, and he has the opposite point of view. It's great. Both are valid. You can draw inspiration from both. You don't need to end up on some forum debating like, oh, real life is more than the photograph, or no, the photograph can elevate the moment. It depends who you follow. It depends who's your influence. So choose your influences wisely. Next, I want to talk about the famous quote by Gary Winogrand. I photograph to find out what something looks like photographed. It's not just a cool one-liner, a non-answer to whatever the question he was asked. If you take it literally, take it apart, Gary is saying two important things here. One, the photograph doesn't look like the thing is photographed. What he's saying here is it's not transparent. And two, he can't even predict the way in which the photograph will differ from reality. He has to take the picture to find out. I take photograph to find out how something looks photographed. So yes, Gary is saying no photograph is transparent to him. And what he's interested in is discovering new ways in which the photograph will depart from transparency, new cracks for authorship to seep through. So really, in this witty one-liner, old Gary has found the perfect mission statement, not just for him, but for generations of photographers, curators, art critics. The question, though, is If I showed my mom a John Gossage picture, would she get it? Would she get all that from the picture? So maybe your authorship is only as strong as who you show the work to. When you're dealing with people from the art world, you're safe. Magazine editors, gallery and museum people, they're broken in. Their brains has been rewired to always look at the actual photograph, never transparently at the subject of the photograph. That's how work like that of the Düsseldorf School of Photography has been successful. The gatekeepers of the art world understood that there's just as much artistry in making choices towards transparency as there are in making choices towards authorship. But if their success had depended on curators of Instagram reposting accounts, do you think people like Thomas Ruff would have made it as far? Because when it comes to lay people who don't have an education in visual arts and are not very sophisticated viewers, I know how it sounds bad, but these people will tend to always miss those points about transparency and only see the subject. In Joel Meyerowitz, The Question of Color, a recent book that's probably still available, he talks about how people didn't understand he was making art photographs until he was able to hand them a black and white print. There's this passage in the book where he describes showing slideshows to his friends in the early 60s. He says, people would sit, and I noticed that no one ever got up to walk up to the wall and look at a detail and say, what's going on here? How come she looks a little like a swan? I saw the relationship in a split second, says Meyerowitz, but they look at the whole picture like it's kind of an entertainment, like it's a travelogue. And I thought, how do I get them to look closely? Very shortly after this episode, Meyerowitz visits Gary Winogrand, and he flips through Gary's prints, and then he understands that those black and white prints, those artifacts that you can hold in your hand and rearrange and sequence, they have a very different impact on a viewer than a color slideshow does. I'm sure we've all had that happen to us. You show a friend a picture that you're fond of, and all they can see is the subject. Why are you handing me a picture of that thing? In that case, your picture is too transparent for that audience. They cannot see the artwork, only the subject. This actually happened to me in Christmas 2016. I had just been to New York City and I had shot a project that I was very proud of. So for Christmas presents to my family, I made some prints and framed them. When I handed my brother and my sister-in-law a print of this image, the sister-in-law asked, why are you giving us a photo of that old dude? And she wasn't wrong to feel that way. To us who are immersed in the photography world, there's clues here that this is a serious artwork. The subject matter itself, it's something that's always been very popular with photographers, and especially was popular in the 2010s after people like Alex South had gotten a lot of attention. The rigorous composition here, the uniform color palette, the timing of the shot, and the attention to the gesture of the cats, all decisions and all clues that show that this is work made seriously. But it is still a very transparent picture. It's in color, it's framed really front on, it has a large depth of field, it feels very transparent too, it's easy to just look at the subject. Back then I did not have the words to explain why that picture did not work for my sister-in-law, but now I do, and I just did. Your transparency or your authorship is your style. Do not go and change it. I'm not saying you need to be less transparent to be more successful. If you are an artist that makes transparent pictures, mind the context. It will be easy to swipe over your picture on Instagram and dismiss it as a snapshot. It will be easier to take it seriously if it is encountered on a wall, nicely framed, in a setting where people are used to encounter art. So if you are transparent in photography, you're going to have to be more mindful of the context you put your photographs in. It's a very exciting and fascinating subject, and I'm sure you're going to have a lot of fun. So this is what I have for you today on transparency and authorship. Transparency is cool. Authorship is cool. Having a subject that is more than your photograph can work. Making a photograph that is more than its subject works too. I guess what's important in the end is to understand all these concepts and make informed choices. You know the old trope about Picasso painting like a 6-year-old. But Picasso knows exactly why he paints this way. The 6-year-old paints this way because he can only paint this way. Be like Picasso, don't be like a 6-year-old. Like the editor character played by Bill Murray in The French Dispatch says to his writers,
try to make it sound like you wrote it that way on purpose.
which is a nice teaser for our next topic, which will be intentionality. Until then, I wish you a very nice summer. I'll talk to you sometime about another topic. Cheers.